Thank you. Thank you. Is this? Is that better? Okay. But can you hear me? Does the mic pick it up? Okay, great. Oh, good. Good microphones. Surprise, it's a radio station. They know how to do microphones. Thank you, Chad. Thank you very much. And thank you, Janet. And thank you, Laura. And thank you, everybody who works with AM 950, Minnesota's Progressive Voice. I am so pleased to have been on the station all these years and very honored to be here. To get right into this, you will recall I was here a couple of years ago when a new book had come out called Rebooting the American Dream, where I started out, the first chapter was Alexander Hamilton's 11-point plan for American manufacturers about how to turn America into a great industrial nation. In 1791, he presented that to Congress. The majority of it was either passed by Congress or put into place by President George Washington. Hamilton was his Secretary of the Treasury by 1793. And we had a trade system, an economy that pretty much worked pretty solidly from the George Washington administration right up until the 1980s. And there was some pretty extraordinary stuff that came out of that. One of the things, and in fact, Senator Bernie Sanders read part of that book from the floor during his 7 or 8 or 9 hour filibuster. And he signed a letter, and we sent a copy, gave a copy, hand-delivered a copy to all 99 of his colleagues in the U.S. Senate, because we all felt at that time, a couple of years back, that if these 11 things were done in this book, that we not only could pull America back from the abyss of the crash of 2008, but we could turn America back into that extraordinary, powerful industrial powerhouse and strong middle class that we once had. The bad news is that nobody in Congress, well, a lot of Democrats actually in Congress paid attention to that. Nancy Pelosi got some really good legislation out of the House. President Obama pushed a number of the concepts that were in that book. All of them died with Republican filibusters in the Senate, and which was, really very unfortunate. And I don't mean this to be totally partisan. There were a number of Democrats who were not on board too. But we need to acknowledge that since the Supreme Court, which is the next book that I'm working on right now, since the Supreme Court decided that this is actually a constitutional monarchy and they can strike down laws, something that's not in the Constitution, we have this doctrine of money is not actually property, it's speech, and corporations aren't actually artificial legal entities, they're people, and strange things happen in the political world. So to take that out of the partisan realm, it really is a structural political problem. Which leads us to the crash of 2016. When I was a kid, I was probably 8, 9 years old, thereabouts. I was a science fiction junkie, and I used to get every month amazing stories. I think John Campbell was the guy who edited it, and writers like Robert Silverberg and Poul Anderson and Jack Vance, and Frank Herbert, and just the geniuses of the era would write this brilliant science fiction. And I remember a story that has stuck with me all these years that I used to open the crash of 2016. We went looking for the story and couldn't find it. So of course, this was before the internet, so I'm going to have to tell it to you from memory rather than reading it to you. But my recollection of the story was something like this. Now keep in mind, this was when I was 7, 8, 9 years old. That was like in the late 50s, early 60s, and so when I was 9 years old, that was 1960. So this was before anybody had seen the backside of the moon, before we had sent people to the moon. In fact, it was before I think John Glenn even went up and circled the Earth. And so in the story, these astronauts are the first to leave the Earth and go into orbit around the moon. And they're going to see what the backside of the moon is like. And there's all this suspense. What is the backside of the moon like? What is going on the back? Because the moon, one side always faces us, and nobody knows. Might there be an ancient spaceship crashed back there? Could it be that it's like, are there volcanoes? Could there be water? Might there be, you know, a jungle with dinosaurs? Who knows? You know, it's the backside of the moon. Nobody's ever seen it in, you know, all of human history. And so as the space capsule goes around the front side of the moon, and as they get to the side, they're preparing for radio silence, right, as they go around the backside, because they're figuring it's going to block their radio waves. And they get around the backside of the moon, and they turn off the transmitter to Earth, figuring that it wouldn't do any good anyway, let's save some power. And they look out the window, and it's like, oh my God. And then the debate among the guys in the capsule is, do we tell them? And it virtually turns into a fist fight in the space capsule, you know. And ultimately they decided not to tell us, not to tell them, that they would just go around and say, oh, it looks pretty much like the front side. Because when they got around the back side of the moon, what they saw when they looked back, remember the old roller coasters that were made out of these 2x4 trellises, you know, that held them up? That's what they saw. The back side of the moon was all 2x4s holding up the canvas, which was the front side of the moon. So the front side of the moon was this canvas superstructure over a 2x4 infrastructure that held it in place. And they were like, you know, we're just not sure people are ready for this. That is the perfect metaphor for our economy, tragically. It looks great. People say, oh, you know, the stock market has doubled since 2008. It goes up every day. Aren't things wonderful? I mean, it's just the rich are richer than they've ever been before. I mean, literally, like richer than the Roman Empire, richer than any kings of history. I mean, it's mind-boggling, the wealth that has been produced in particular the last 32 years in this country. The corporations are showing record profits, higher profits than at any time in the history of Earth in the United States and around the world, the transnational corporations. So isn't everything wonderful? Well, it turns out everything's not wonderful. That what we have seen is, since roughly 1980 to today, wages have flattened out. And there's been a very real consequence to that, which I'll get into in just a second. But first of all, what were we expecting when we came into 1980, into the Reagan Revolution, this really radical change where we shifted out of FDR-onomics, you know, New Deal economic systems, and into the modern kind of economics that we have that brought about the crash of 28 and that's going to make the crash of 2016 happen. And why? One of the things that economists will tell you, and you can look this stuff up, it's not all that hard to find, is that as productivity increases, literally from the George Washington administration to today, as productivity has increased, in fact, let's define productivity first of all. Productivity is the ability of a given unit of labor, basically one person working, but you know, a given unit of labor, to produce a certain amount of goods or services. And as productivity goes up, not only do you get more goods and services, but whoever is hiring that labor gets presumably more profit. Right? So productivity is a function of profit. Productivity is a function of what's being produced. But historically, what we've seen, and there have been some bumps along the way that have had to do with things like the Civil War and World War I and whatnot, and some peaks along the way having to do with, like, you know, Eli Whitney inventing the cotton gin, and then in the 1830s, and then in the 1880s, the Industrial Revolution, and the, you know, dot-com bubble and things like that. But by and large, from the George Washington administration until the Ronald Reagan administration, for that roughly 200-year period, as productivity went up, wages went up with it. If you look at the two lines, they follow each other. As people got more efficient, they were rewarded for that efficiency with more pay, or worked fewer hours. In the 19th century, people were working 60, 70, in some cases 80-hour weeks. By 1900, the average was in the neighborhood of 60-hour a week. By the 1920s, it was the 50-hour week. By the 1940s, the 1950s, we were institutionalizing the 40-hour work week. And so what we've seen is that wages have gone up or workload